right. I think it's doing it. Okay, so maybe if you could get the light, that'd be good. So yesterday we started talking about the French and Indian Wars with an S. Our main focus is going to be the French and Indian War. How many French and Indian Wars were there in the series? Yes.
4.
Yeah, there were 4, right? The last of them is the one that we're going to kind of focus on, which is just known as the French and Indian War. And we had also said yesterday there was one main sort of question in the back of our brain that we were going to try to keep in mind as we talk about all this stuff over the next several days. And what's that one main big question that we've got going?
What events led to the Revolutionary War?
Yeah, Revolutionary War. So this war, French and Indian War, is in the 1750s. Revolutionary War doesn't start until the 1770s. So they're not even thinking about having a revolution right now, right? I mean, that's not even in their brain quite yet, most people. But the things that are happening now are going to lead to that occurring. So that's why we got this in our brain. So that's the big question, what events led to the Revolutionary War? Then I had you guys write down these 5 focus questions, which yesterday we actually didn't answer any of them, but these are the ones that we're going to continue working off of until we do get them all answered. Then this was the map going into the French and Indian War. Because who was the French and Indian War between?
French versus British.
Yeah, it was France and their Native American allies, so French and Indian, versus the British, and at this point you would include the colonists, the soon-to-be Americans, the English colonists in that war. So basically, France versus Great Britain is what we were looking at here. Those we talked about there. Fort Duquesne. Who built this?
French.
Why? Yeah, French. Why? Yep.
They're trying to conquer land that was in the dispute between the British and the French.
Yeah. So there was this big chunk here that was this here, and France said that's ours. The British said no, it's not. It's ours. And so France figured that if we want to keep this land, we better have people there. And if we're going to have people there, it makes sense that the first people that go there be soldiers. And the soldiers need a fort, so let's build Fort Duquesne. And so they set about doing that. The colonists, the British colonists, discovered what they were doing. And so they didn't like it, right? Because France said that land was theirs. The British said, nope, that land's ours. So then what happened was the colonists, the British, sent a particular guy out to that disputed territory, basically to tell the French that they need to get out of there. And so that 22-year-old guy went out there, told the French to leave, and the French said, no, I have a better idea. How about you leave? And so that 22-year-old guy had to leave, and the French stayed. And where we left off yesterday was, I wonder who in the world that 22-year-old guy was. It was George Washington. Yeah, George Washington was the guy. So just 22 at this point, so he was still a young guy. So he went out there. The British told him that, or the French told him that he had to leave, so he basically did. But then he came back, this time with some more soldiers. And the idea is we're going to maybe try to get the French pushed out of here, right? We're going to fight, shoot bullets at each other. Favorite pastime of the British and the French. So George Washington heads back out, runs into some French, and turns out runs into more French than he could deal with. So he thought, this isn't going to work out at all. I better take off. So he took off, and the French decided they were going to go after him. And for George Washington, it became pretty obvious that they were going to catch him. So he decided that he better build some way to protect himself. So he decided that he was going to build a fort. And being that the French were right on his tail, is this kind of a fort that you're going to build that's going to be super dynamic and amazing? No, right? I mean, basically, it was what can we put up as quick as possible? And I'll show you a picture of it in just a second. But he gave it sort of an interesting name. Does anybody by chance know what that was? He found it very necessary that he create this fort to protect he and his soldiers from the French. And so he called it Fort Necessity. And that's what it looked like right there. So here's Fort Necessity. This isn't the actual one, but this is what it looked like. The actual one was, ended up getting taken down. But this is basically what it looked like. So George Washington and his troops holed up inside Fort Necessity. The French showed up, and it did not go very well for George Washington. So he actually was defeated at Fort Necessity. And this was the only time in his entire military career. So, we have this war, and then we have the Revolutionary War and everything after. This was the only time that George Washington ever actually had to surrender. So he surrendered to the French at Fort Necessity, and you can see this in the lower corner. This was the actual surrender papers, and there's George Washington's signature. His actual signature. That's a picture of the actual paper. So what the French did with George Washington is they defeated him, they beat him, and then they told him, basically, you can go. So they let him leave. So George Washington and his soldiers, they didn't take prisoner, and nothing like that. They just let him go, right? And so George Washington and his troops marched out of there. But what was significant about Fort Necessity is this was the first battle in the French and Indian War, right? So this was the battle that started it all off. Now we're not going to get into together much about the actual war itself. I've got a video clip that's going to kind of go through a quick summary of the whole bit. But Fort Necessity, first battle of the French and Indian War, and that war started in the colonies, right? Started here at Fort Necessity, but then spread to Europe. So all the way in the backwoods of the colonies, this battle happened, spread all the way across the ocean into Europe, and became a major deal. In Europe, they didn't call it the French and Indian War. They called it the 7 Years' War. And do you know how long the 7 Years' War lasted? 9. Makes perfect sense, right? Okay, now, back in the colonies, who's this guy? Benjamin Franklin. Was this in here? Somebody in here asked about this flag yesterday. Was that in here? Or maybe another hour. So Benjamin Franklin saw what was happening here, right? I mean, like, this was a very serious situation in the colonies with there being a war between the British and the French. And so what Benjamin Franklin thought is, we better get ourselves organized. Okay? And so they had this convention, this meeting in Albany, New York, right? And so at this meeting, what Benjamin Franklin proposed was that the colonies would basically unite, kind of create this united colonies, and when you look at this flag, this join or die flag, you guys have probably seen that before. a lot of times you'll see it talking about the Revolutionary War, but it actually came from the French and Indian War. And so when you look at it, what you've got is snake, right, in a bunch of different pieces. And if you were on, like, say you were out hiking somewhere, and if you came up on a snake that was in 8 pieces, just like laying on the trail in 8 pieces, would you be afraid of that snake? Or would it just sort of be, this is actually pretty gross right now, but I'm not actually fearful that this snake, something's going to happen? Would you be afraid of it? No, probably not. You would look at it and be like, that's super gross and somebody's very strange for doing that to a snake, but probably you wouldn't be afraid of it. And that's kind of what Benjamin Franklin is saying. Like each of these letters on it, like, so at the front of the snake it says NE. What do you think that means? New England, yep. What about NY? New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, right? So those are basically the original colonies. Now, New England here, they kind of clumped a bunch of them together, you know, like Massachusetts and Connecticut and like those sort of together. But those are the original colonies. And so what Benjamin Franklin says is if the colonies are all separate, right, and operate kind of separately, completely of each other, we're going to have a real problem trying to fight the French. Okay, so what Benjamin Franklin says is we need to come together, okay, as sort of a united colonies, and if we do that, then the snake's not in pieces anymore. And then if you were on your hiking trail and you come up to a snake that is very much alive and very angry that you're there, you might have a little bit of a different feeling about it, right? Like now you're like, this is serious business. And that's what Benjamin Franklin says. He says, if we are, as colonies, when this war's happening, if we're going to be divided, we're in trouble. But if we come together, we're going to have a much better chance of surviving this thing. Okay? So out of this conference, out of this meeting in Albany, they came up with what was known as the Albany Plan of Union, right? And then they presented it to the colonies, and who else would they have to present it to? The what? Well, there was no president yet. There was no United States, but who's the guy in charge? The British. Who's in charge of the British? The king, right? So they had to. So they presented it to the colonial governments and said, you know, we should kind of come together, create kind of this united colonies. And they had to present it to King George and say, what we want to do is have the colonies come together kind of as one. And everybody looked at Benjamin Franklin's plan and said, what do you think? Every one of them said, this is terrible. We absolutely hate it. And the colonists said, this gives way too much power to the king, and we don't want to give that much power to him. And the king said, oh, this plan gives way too much power to the colonies, and I'm not willing to give that power to the colonies. So both sides hated it. And so Benjamin Franklin said, well, then it must be pretty good if everybody hates it. If everybody says it gives the other group too much power, then it must be pretty good. And then it kind of went away. So why in the world would have I even told you about that? What a crazy thing to say that never happened. Yeah. It does come back. And it comes back in the Revolutionary War, right? When the United States is becoming the United States and gaining independence, they sort of take this plan out of the drawer and dust it off and use a bunch of the ideas from it. So Benjamin Franklin kind of had it nailed. He just had it nailed about 20 years too soon. But that was where this plan comes from. All right, so like I said, I'm going to show you a video that's going to give you an idea about some of this stuff. But we'll fast forward for a second and get to the end of the war, and I'll spoil the surprise. And guess who wins? The British win. Okay? Now, if you're going to end a war, when a war ends, generally there is a treaty that ends that war. The treaty that ended the French and Indian War was called the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris. And what the Treaty of Paris did, which was very significant, is if you look at this map, this was the one I showed you before, about the time the French and Indian War started, and the French owned all, or at least claimed all of this land, like a ton of land in North America. They fight the war, and at the end of the war, 1763, this is what the map looks like. And where's France? Yeah. Yeah, so all that they have left is here, but as far as mainland North America, they are completely gone, right? So what was super significant about the French and Indian War is it removed France from North America. So after this war, 1763, France was basically gone. Yeah.
Is this part of the called the Louisiana Purchase, or is that later?
The Louisiana Purchase comes later. And I'm interested that you actually pulled that, because who did we buy that land from?
French.
France. And I'm telling you right now that France is totally gone, aren't I?
Yeah.
So something's going to happen, but we won't talk about that yet. But for the time being, France completely gone. And that was what was significant about the Treaty of Paris, in that they lost all of their land in North America, mainland North America. All right, then I told you I was going to show you a little summary video of the French and Indian War, and here it is. Some fancy music.
The French and Indian War.
Events in history are connected with each other, and wars are no exception. The origin of the American Revolution came from a war that occurred 2 decades earlier, the French and Indian War.
One of the hottest real estate markets in the 17th and 18th centuries was North America. Fertile soil, cheap or free land, beaver pelts. America had it all.
Here's a peek at North America in 1713. Britain claimed the East Coast and most of what's now Canada. France claimed the middle of North America. England claimed the lower areas here.
The two world powers, Britain and France, would butt heads periodically. Between 1689 and 1763, Britain and France went to war against each other 4 times, along with the nations who allied with them. The first 3 of these wars started in Europe, with the battles between their North American colonies a sideshow.
The fourth war, the French and Indian War, was different. The French and Indian War started in America. At stake was dominion for the entire continent. The war lasted from 1754 to 1763, but since fighting in Europe didn't start until 1756, Europeans call it the 7 Years' War.
In this corner, weighing in at 225 pounds and sipping a cup of Earl Grey, Britain and its American colonies. The challenger, weighing in at 190 pounds and trying to spread stuff on a baguette that doesn't belong on it, France and its American Indian allies.
Spain would join with France later in the war. American Indians actually fought on both sides of the war, but most of them allied themselves with the French, who traded with them and were less threatening than the more powerful Britain.
The French and Indian War started with a border dispute. Both France and Britain's Virginian colonists claimed land in western Pennsylvania and the upper Ohio River Valley. The governor of Virginia, who felt the French were trespassing on their territory, sent out a young major to tell the French to get going.
The major's name? George Washington. Ba-ba-ba-ba.
When the French refused to leave, Washington was sent back to launch an attack. He won a small skirmish and then got his butt kicked in a larger battle, the news of which prompted the King of Britain to proclaim words that would become immortal in history. Let's get it on!
The war started off poorly for the British and American colonists. In 1756, the war spread to Europe and morphed into a world war. The British and American colonists eventually won and beat the French, and the spoils of war were settled by the Treaty of Paris in 1763.
The Treaty of Paris left France without any territory in North America.
Au revoir, Frenchie.
France's naval trade was also crippled by the war. The British Empire now ruled supreme in the New World.
So in 1763, Britain scores a huge victory with some help from the colonists. The colonists are proud to be British citizens. It's high fives and biscuits all around. 13 years later, they revolt and declare independence against the monarchy.
What happened? Part of the answer lies in the after effects of the French and Indian War.
1. By eliminating the French in North America, the British had also removed one of the strongest reasons the colonies had for staying loyal to Great Britain: protection from the French.
2. The war made Britain's debts skyrocket. In Britain's eyes, they fought the war for American colonists. So shouldn't the colonists help pay for it and their continuing defense with some new taxes?
3. The British wanted to avoid another costly colonial battle if possible. So to prevent conflict with the Indian tribes in the area, they restricted colonial expansion to the west.
These new taxes and restrictions on expansion, along with the greater imperial control and a feeling that their rights as British citizens were being violated, gradually fed colonial resentment to the point of revolution.
Okay, so if we go back to our focus questions, we've actually answered a couple of them today now. And the first one, what happened in the colonies as a result of the French and Indian War? I might have actually worded that kind of clunky, but what changed from the start of the French and Indian War to the end of it? Something that was very different. Yeah, the French got basically booted out, right? Then next one, identify and describe the Albany Plan of Union, and that was whose plan? Yeah, Benjamin Franklin. And what did he want the colonies to do? Yeah, right. Join or die. He wanted the colonies to come together. And did they think his plan was a great idea? Nope. Did the king think the plan was a great idea? Nope. So it kind of got pushed to the wayside until, the reason I'm telling you about it is because we'll talk about it later more too, but it comes back when the United States becomes the United States and the colonies declare independence. What treaty ended the French and Indian War? Yeah.
The Treaty of Paris.
The Treaty of Paris, right? So those were the three then that we answered today. And you've got two more hanging out there. So anybody have problems or questions about any of this business? All right. Then